In America, what we have seen is that our efforts to reform education have not been led by the communities that are most effective, have not been led by the children and parents that are the most affected, have not been full of folks who are representative of our communities. And I think that what we have received in turn is that our efforts haven't been as effective as we wanted them to be, right? So it's not just a question of morality. And let's be clear, it is a question of morality, right? It is a question of ensuring that the very people that we are claiming to support are actually at the table, leading the table, building the table, deciding who needs to sit at the table, right? That is absolutely a moral question, but it's also a question of efficacy. When we are not inclusive of and led by our communities, we are ultimately ineffective at creating the change that we seek. And that is what has come back to us 25, 30 years later in education reform in America, that we skipped straight over people. We decided to do work to communities instead of with communities, and standing behind communities and standing with communities. And as a result, we haven't created the massive waves of change that we wanted. It created years of entrenched practices for us that dehumanize us in the same way, in similar ways as the ways it dehumanizes our students, right? Because we practice those things and we get used to them and they become habitual. And then it's harder to open up the table, or it's harder to give up our seat, right? It's harder to silence ourselves so that other voices can rise. You know, if we think about this like a tree, right? What we are essentially talking about is a tree that has been forever rooted in rotten soil. Right? And so the branches are weak, the fruit is rotten, everything that it bears from housing inequity to Islamophobia to inequitable education come from that tree, right? What it feels like we have been doing in education reform is moving to a different part of the same field and planting a new tree in the same soil. And then we get frustrated when the fruit is just as rotten and the branches are just as weak, right? Instead of saying to the people from that community, do you all want to build trees? Where is the best field to build trees? Because we keep building it in a rotten field, right? What are the best kinds of trees to plant here, right? Is it an apple tree, right? Is it a pear? Like, what is the right tree? Who are the right farmers, right? Because you all know your land better than we do. And so you all actually need to be the ones to plant the right tree in the right place, to nurture it, feed it, water it as it should be, and then to give out the fruit to your people, right? So the problem is we want to come in and say, well, we want to come in once the tree is already planted in rotten fruit and then switch out the farmer, right? Or switch out the location in the same field, right? Or switch out who we give the fruit to. So we keep taking one minute part of a larger process instead of starting the whole process over completely differently, right? So to apply that analogy would mean if we are entering into a community where we know folks are saying we want a different education for our young people, it means starting from scratch, right? It doesn't mean giving people a seat at the table. It means saying, how do you actually want to have this meeting? Do you want to have it over a table? Do you want to have it in a circle? Do you want to have it around a lake? Do you want to have it sitting on the floor? How are you going to build the space that will set the vision for what education will look like in this community? How will you raise the leaders, right? And decide who you want to till this land, who you want to actually lead this process, and how you want the rest of us to engage, right? We keep on coming in the middle of the process, at the end of the process, in one part of the process and saying this is the answer, instead of looking at the entire process in total, handing all of the control over to the people and saying it's your process, you tell us how to operate. I think that the role varies depending on what you're trying to accomplish and who your audience is. And I think the best way for us to tell those of us who have positional privilege, financial privilege, professional privilege, whatever, racial privilege, whatever it may be, the best way for us to figure out which role we should be playing when is to ask and actually listen to the answer. And I know that sounds so elementary, but I really found that is the best thing. So I will give an analogy from our protest work in Ferguson. There are a lot of ways in which I am absolutely from the community that's most affected, right? I am a Black woman who videotapes every single police encounter I have. Whenever I'm pulled over in my car, I turn on my cell phone video camera because I never know if that could be my last moment. I've been tear gassed several times, pepper sprayed as a peaceful protester. I'm absolutely a part of the most affected in circumstances of police violence and brutality in America. Still though, and especially on the streets of Ferguson, I was somebody who came into the space with privilege. I had a lot of positional privilege, right? That gave me access to people like the governor of our state or the mayor of our city or elected officials, right? Because I ran an organization that was well respected in the community. I have financial privilege because I make a reliable, good salary. I have health benefits, right? And so when I got tear gas, I could go to the doctor and not worry about where the money was coming from or if my insurer would cover it. So when it was 2 a.m. and people hadn't eaten after leaving the protest line, I could pay for my food and other people's food, right? When people needed to get across the city, I could pay for gas and had a car with a car note that I could afford, right? So there were lots of ways in which I was operating with privilege. I'm also cisgendered, right? I am also heterosexual. So there were lots of ways in which I was operating in privilege in the broader protester community. And so there were times that I would just ask folks, what do you want me to do? If anything, right? If the answer was, we don't need anything from you right now, I needed to be okay with that and put my pride to the side and say, well, there's other work that I can be doing if I'm not needed in this space, right? Because I still have a job where 20,000 students, most of whom who look just like me, are relying on me every day, right? So like, there is something for me to do. If folks said, we do need you, but we don't need you out front, right? There are lots of newsreels from Ferguson and news footage that I'm not in because I wasn't the one up there leading the chants, right? I didn't need to be the one up there leading the chants, right? Poor Black women did, right? Like that's who actually needed to be up there leading it. And so I was okay bringing the water, right? And chanting from behind and helping to, and staying at the end of the line to make sure that everybody was safe and corralled. And I don't always have to be out front. I had to make a deal with my pride, if you will, to say, you're not going to reign supreme here. But there were also times when I did need to be out front. Because of the positional privilege I had, sometimes the governor would listen to somebody like me versus somebody else. And so I needed to make sure that I was listening to what the people were saying, so that whatever I was telling to the governor was the truth and not something of my own imagination, right? And so there were times when I needed to play that role of leader, right? Or being in a space of formal or archetypical leadership. And those times mattered too, right? Because those times were about me leveraging my privilege for the good of the people instead of the good, my own good, right? And so that doesn't mean that all privileged people always need to get out of the way. That doesn't mean that all privileged people always need to be out front. It means that at any given point in time, there is a different play that's happening. And when there's a different play that's happening, sometimes you're running the ball, sometimes, sorry, it's American football analogy. Sometimes you're running the ball, sometimes you're catching the ball, right? Like sometimes you are helping to coach from the sidelines, sometimes you're encouraging the other players who are on the field. And that is, all of that is right and good. And if we get our egos out of that equation, we can actually play all of those different roles effectively. When it comes to spaces of access, so I was a member of the Ferguson Commission and also President Obama's 21st Century Policing Task Force. I teach for America. I sit in a senior role that oversees our national alliances with communities of color. Everyone on my team is a person of color. My role is often to be an advocate in any of those spaces that I named, right? And saying, here's what we're hearing from our Native communities, here's what we're hearing from our Asian American communities, here's what we're hearing from our undocumented community. And because all 7 of the people that I manage don't sit at this table and I am here to help represent them, I need to be listening effectively to them so what I'm sharing is truthful, and then coming back to them and saying, here's what we're hearing, so here's the information that it will be helpful for you to continue to provide, right? So I see my role as an advocate. I see my role fundamentally as a truth teller, right? As someone who recognizes protest as telling the truth out loud and in public, whether I'm sitting next to the president or sitting next to our CEO or talking with a teacher or a superintendent or a student. There is authority that comes with my title. With that authority comes a great deal of responsibility to make sure that I am always telling the truth. And that is the single most important role that I feel like I play in any space, right? So sometimes that means agreeing with what's happening. Sometimes that means not agreeing with what's happening. Sometimes that means encouraging people who are out there on the front lines doing the work, like folks who are teaching in our classrooms or parents who are volunteering in our schools, and encouraging them to keep going, to know that people with resources have their back, and so let us know what you need. And sometimes telling that truth means being willing to risk the seat that I have at the table, because the truth that I have to tell isn't something that you necessarily will want to hear, but I need to take this risk, otherwise it won't be in the conversation. I often try to think about what will not be in the conversation if I don't say it, given my perspective, given my identity, given who I work for and work with, given the communities that I have access to and credibility in. What is the truth that I am responsible to bring forth that won't be said if my voice isn't heard? That's how I think about myself in the spaces where I do have to leverage my privilege. I'm somebody who believes in a dual approach, right? I'm a fervent believer in bottom up and top down so that we can all meet in the middle. I believe in like an inside and outside strategy, right? So in a movement context, right? Like I believe in the importance of protest and I believe in the importance of policy, both. That said, if we only recruit people who have access to the top spots and create change with them, the same people will ultimately always have access to those top spots, right? So sometimes we have to think critically about whether or not we are playing somebody else's game or whether or not we're changing the game altogether. You know, I think about what it means for us to be recruiting at Teach for America more people who come directly from the communities that we serve. It means that eventually there will be more principals of color in America, right? And more principals who come from the community that they're leading a school in, right? That if there are more principals, then there will be more superintendents, right? Who reflect the great diversity of America. If there are more superintendents that reflect the diversity of America, then in the future, hopefully we can have more United States Secretaries of Education, right? Who are not all white and who are not mostly men, right? If that's the case, right, then we can finally have a president who's not a man, right? Or finally have another president who's a person of color. God forbid, we'd hopefully have a woman of color in the office, right? And so if we are not recruiting people who come directly from our communities and preparing them for leadership, whether it's traditional or non-traditional, we will end up in the same cycle, right? We won't actually see those who are equipped to make change look any different because we keep recruiting and putting the same people in those positions. So I get that sometimes we have to play the game in order to get into the position to create change, but sometimes we just need to change the game altogether.